What is up, everybody? Welcome to the 4for Formula One podcast. Today we are recapping the Saudi Arabian Gran Prix. I will give a quick general recap here, go over in depth what we saw in the DFS streets over on DraftKings, and cover some betting stuff that we noticed from the race weekend as well. I'm your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com. Today, I'm with Sam Hoppen, the data analytics manager at BetSperts and 4for4. Sam, what's up, buddy?
How you doing? I'm doing great. It's fun to be here. We were talking right before the show. It's a fun to be back in content creating world. The past couple months I've been in model building, projection, site building world, and it's nice to be back, especially talking about my newest passion in Formula One.
Yeah, I mean, before we get into everything today, I've only been doing the shows with Dan so far. So talk a bit about your DFS your DFS, your betting background, and then your interest or history in F1.
Sure. So I've primarily played NFL DFS in the past. Have gotten a lot more into betting, which we'll talk about here in a little bit as it relates to Formula One as well. Have primarily, again, written and done content on the redraft side of things, but very interested in the DFS side of things for Formula One specifically. I've been a lifelong fan of Formula One since the beginning of January this year. I, like many people, got into Formula One through Drive to Survive. And so the last 2 weeks have been the first two live races that I've watched. And I feel like I've been spoiled just with the races that we've had. But yeah, excited to talk through this. And I mean, I've been learning a lot too about some of the more nuances about Formula One recently, about this type of DFS too. This is obviously a little bit closer to what we see in like NFL Showdown slates as opposed to your main slate type DFS, but it makes it that much more interesting and challenging and a bit more to research as well.
Yeah, no matter what you're doing, it's always going to be a little more exciting if you got a couple shekels riding on the sport of choice. We've talked about this with Dan. Like, we're not going to pretend to be experts at all on F1 technical analysis. There is a ton of content on YouTube or just any really F1 channel. There's a lot of very knowledgeable follows, shows, articles, but I think we can at least we can pose as experts because it is such a new game to DFS. So no matter how much people have watched Formula One before, there are just nuances to DFS that people like us are going to have the advantage in, especially with a brand new game. We only have 2 weeks of DFS history in Formula One. So we can go through what we've seen so far, what we expect to happen in DFS and also in the betting markets, and have an advantage, even if you don't know a lot about Formula One, even if you know nothing about Formula One. I mean, you think about the kind of like the film versus data argument in NFL, and I am strongly on the data side. And I think from a fantasy standpoint, especially with daily fantasy, I think you could be phenomenal at pretty much any daily fantasy game without watching 1 second of the sport. So I think that should be an encouragement to people that are thinking about playing Formula One DFS that haven't got into the sport yet. I think a show like this and the data that we have been putting out and will continue to put out can really help you formulate a very competitive lineup. And we've been very competitive. We haven't got that first place yet, but in the big tournament, I've been one lineup behind the first place both weeks. The game is going to continue to evolve. DFS is never going to be easy. The players are going to evolve. The websites are going to evolve to make the games tougher. But these brand new niche games, and that's what I like about it, is it's brand new. It's really a good time to dive into these things and be out in front of it. So if you haven't checked out Formula One yet, I'd really encourage listeners or viewers to go back to our first podcast, the Bahrain recap, and Dan and I, over the first 20 or 30 minutes, just go over why we think Formula One DFS and betting is really exciting. But let's jump into Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. It was a fantastic race. Let's just talk just a general recap as casual viewers. What jumped out to you? What surprised you from the race?
So I think, obviously, don't want to bury the lead here. Verstappen won the race, beat Charles Leclerc by a couple of seconds there. And going into the last couple of laps, there was a sentiment of, was Verstappen going to learn from what happened the week prior when he overtook Charles a little bit too early in the race, and Leclerc was able to recover from that, come back and win the race. It ended up not being that way. Verstappen took home the win, and I think that's, obviously a big deal, especially for Red Bull, who didn't get any points the week before in the Constructors or the Drivers' Championship. Both cars petered out at the end. And so locking that up, it's going to be Red Bull and Ferrari for most of the way until we see Mercedes or one of these other teams try and jump up into the top tier.
Yeah, from a fan perspective, I mean, you talked about being spoiled with the first two races. With all the new regulation changes this year, that's why it's really exciting for brand new or newer Formula One fans, with anybody that is a Drive to Survive, with the Drive to Survive entry into Formula One. Is really getting spoiled because we are seeing the overtaking. We are seeing these really nuanced changes in strategies to where teams are trying to figure out how to be good. Like if you watched last year or the year before, in those situations, Max would usually just power through, get the overtake, and then there was nothing they could do. Now we're seeing these little nuanced strategies. We've seen it 2 weeks in a row now, where Max overtakes too early. Charles kind of lets him overtake because he knows once he gets out of that corner, he can open up DRS and take over again. We actually saw that play out with a couple laps to go. And then when Max did the final overtake, we saw he kind of backed off. He realized what happened a few times in the race before, once, and then he got that final overtake, and there was nothing Leclerc could do about it. So that was really exciting to watch. Like you said, we saw Mercedes still struggling with that. They had a setup issue in qualifying, and then we saw them have another big pit stop error, just leaving Hamilton out there forever and not being able to recover from a very late pit stop. Obviously, a few yellow flags had to do with that. But just a little bit of bad luck, but a lot of errors from Mercedes. One thing that was really surprising, and we talked about internally, this course, this racetrack at Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, very high incident the year before. We saw cars really struggling in qualifying. We saw Mick Schumacher have that really tough crash. No incidents except for the solo crash from Latifi, but we did see 5 cars retire from overheating or cooling problems, so still ended up with a lot of variance there. Something else that surprised me, or that was just at least encouraging, McLaren getting into the points with Lando Norris. Obviously, 5 cars retired, but kind of goes to our point from last week of we still don't really know a lot about who the best teams are in these mid or even lower tiers. So McLaren just being the worst team besides Williams in the first race, and then looking pretty competitive, at least with the middle tier guys this week. So that was fun. Any other takeaways or disappointments from the race before we get into some betting and DFS talk?
So the one thing that I noticed right at the beginning of the race, you talked about Hamilton, was he had a different tire strategy to start than the field once again, and that didn't really work out for them last week. He was on the hard tires. I think there was 1 or 2 other drivers on the hard tires to start. His teammate George Russell was not. And it looked, kind of from the start that it might not have paid off again, but he was able to, he made it to lap 39 without switching the tires, was able to get all the way up to, I think, P6 or P7. And then obviously you mentioned the sort of misfortune with the pit stops under the yellow flag, not being able to really take advantage of that.
Yep.
But again, it seems like Mercedes is just trying to throw things at a wall and see what happens to get some sort of advantage. The other couple sort of general takeaways, I guess these are more from a DFS perspective. There is late morning news to be paying attention to, which, we had talked about before Bahrain even. It's like, well, from qualifying to the beginning of the race, like, you're going to have all this time to set your lineups and nothing's really going to change. But we saw Yuki Tsunoda did not even get to start the race. We saw that there was an issue with Carlos Sainz's car, which they ended up fixing, but I'm sure that took some ownership away from Sainz potentially. And so it's, again, like, we've got the next race, which will be in 2 weekends, which is midnight Central Time.
Yeah.
And God knows there likely aren't going to be people staying up that late. And if you can, you might get an advantage there. Not that, stuff like that's going to be happening every week. And then the last sort of overall F1 takeaway is Latifi's just, I don't know what's going on with him.
Yeah.
Like, I saw the most reactions I saw on Twitter were, oh my God, Max and, Charles is going to be a battle. And it's like, what the heck is Latifi doing in Formula One right now? So he likely is not going to be making it into many of my lineups going forward. But certainly an interesting driver.
Yeah. I mean, from going back to your point from a DFS perspective and to a lesser extent a betting perspective, I mean, still relative to other sports, like, there just isn't going to be a ton of news before the race. Having Sainz had some car issues an hour before, and then Yuki not even been able to start. Those type of things, especially like with the Red Bull power system, I think will get ironed out as we get into the season. Stuff like that is going to happen, and I think it is going to be the gift and the curse of Formula One as a DFS sport, especially for us in the U.S. You talked about the race next week. It's a 1 a.m. Eastern time start, I believe. So there are going to be spots where some people aren't going to play because of those time restraints, but that's in a could be a positive because it keeps it a niche. But there are just going to be those weird times, whether it be super late in 2 weeks, or once we get into the heart of the schedule, if you're on the West Coast, some 5 a.m. start times where people just aren't going to either stay up or get up to check those things an hour before the race. And we saw it even yesterday with a very forgiving start time. I still saw a ton of Yuki Tsunoda lineups in the field. So if you have a contingency plan and wake up 30 minutes before and go through a couple of clicks, I think it'll be it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out with the very interesting times that we're going to have coming up. So let's get into DFS. Really, the meat of this podcast is us really going to be dissecting what's going on in F1 DFS land. What was your just kind of like, what's been your approach to DFS over these first couple of weeks, and what was your prep like going into this week?
Yeah, so I think my approach, I've been doing 3 to 5 lineups ish, and I think it's trying to obviously ownership is the big part here with any of these smaller lineup teams, but trying to find obviously the right guys to fade and looking at sort of grid position relative to expectation going into the week. Yep. So I'm trying to think of an example from last week, but fading the guys that might be starting higher on the grid that really shouldn't belong there, and then targeting the guys that are lower on the grid that should be up higher. Now, it was difficult to do that with a guy like Lewis Hamilton this past week because he just costs so much, and so it's tough to fit him into a lineup that really makes sense. But something that you guys have also talked about, which is these +5 bonuses, which really swing things at the bottom of the sort of leaderboard for fantasy points, and taking into consideration both ownership there and, going for the guys that might be at the bottom of the grid that are only separated by their teammate by 2 or 3 spots. Because I think at that point, like, it's not, there's enough going on in these races where so much can go differently that if you're spending an extra $400 on one guy that's 3 spots below, if you're catching, 20% less ownership, then you've got a huge advantage for sure.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that when we get to the results. Obviously, we only had one data point of races to look back on, and that was kind of my thinking too, is that people were just really going to overvalue like the Lance Stroll, Nico Hulkenberg was one that really stood out. I think Hulkenberg was 3,800, Stroll was 3,400. Stroll was starting a couple of great places ahead, but they're both on a very bad team. Yep. So we were thinking that Stroll's just going to get probably not exponentially high, but significantly higher ownership than Hulkenberg, which just doesn't make sense from those lower team spots because, one, we just don't know a lot yet about which teams are good or bad. I mean, at this point, I think we can say like Aston Martin and Williams are probably the two worst teams. But also just what drivers are going to be better. And people are, after one race, it seemed like people were just going to be overconfident in these type of things. And again, just going into the second week ever of Formula One DFS, one thing that I really wanted to at least be cognizant of was that people there was going to be a fair amount of the field that was going to treat results from week one like it was gospel. And what I mean by that is we barely saw any incidents in Bahrain. There was the cars that retired were because of engine troubles or overheating issues. We didn't have incidents. We thought we would see a lot more in Saudi Arabia. Obviously didn't, but just at least accounting and understanding that makes the race different. And then lineup building strategies. We saw captain constructor stacks just absolutely dominate in the first week. I thought about, exploring some different type of stacks, maybe stacking 2 drivers together, having lineups that avoided the captain constructor stacks, and then just kind of thinking through ways to be unique. We saw so many duplicates in the first week that how can we, one, build some unique strategies, and 2, get away from the obvious pay up for Red Bull and Ferrari and pay down for like these. There was a player pool of 5 guys that fit into those lineups. How can we get away from that? Whether it be, playing the Hulkenberg over the Lance Stroll, or just trying to get some mid-salary guys in. And to your point about the +5 bonus, for those that don't know, if you beat your teammate, you get 5 points. And when you compare that to the overall scoring system, you get 25 points for first place. So 20% of first place scoring goes, you could come in 19th and still get 5 points if your teammate finishes in 20th. So that makes it we have to pay very close attention to even the worst teams. And I think it's what really makes it exciting as a new F1 fan. We care about Lance Stroll and Latifi and Albon and all these guys that if you're just watching as even a Drive to Survive fan, you just might not be that interested. So it's been really exciting so far with that. And back to your point about Hamilton, it was a really interesting nuanced spot this week, because really the only way you have ceiling outside of winning and beating your teammate is being able to really climb up the grid. And there just aren't a lot of cars that are going to be able to do that. It's going to take like a Red Bull or a Ferrari, not getting out of Q2, probably an incident, like a crash or something like that. Those are going to be the teams that could really climb the grid, that you could predict it. Hamilton was still too expensive. You need to have for where he was at. I think he was at 10 point. Was he at 10.2? I believe he was in the 5-digit salary, and you need winning upside to be able to roster that. So like we calculated his ceiling. I think it was like if he came in 5th, he would have scored 21 points. Yeah. Still, that just wasn't enough to justify the salary.
I think the other thing too, and I'm trying to remember the point you were making, but trying to think about history as gospel is people thinking they know like who the driver A and the driver B is on teams. And I think, again, having watched Drive to Survive more recently, they sort of play that up a little bit more than I think actually is, used in actual race strategy. And that's normally when, again, you have a guy like Hamilton who is in contention for the drivers' championship, and swapping him with George Russell, isn't going to really impact Russell that much. The team, standings are pretty much going to stay the same. But we saw with the Alpine and sort of race between Ocon and Alonso. I mean, that lasted like 20 laps, it seemed like. And they were just like, have at it. Like, go do your thing. And at one point on the radio, the manager was like, yeah, like they'll figure it out. They'll race for the team at some point. And those bottom teams are just like, we'll take any points we can get. We don't have a favorite at this point. And so I think, though, there are with Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes, the driver A and driver B, but outside of that, there really isn't. And so to think who those drivers are is a bit of a fool's errand.
Yeah, and that actually really played into the results, specifically the Alpine team battle. And let's kind of like use that as a jumping off point to what happened in the DFS contest, because we saw Alonso and Ocon really battling it out. And Ocon was, to me, that was actually the most interesting decision point of the entire week in DFS, because I thought it seems like Alpine has two very strong cars. They have two very strong drivers. And for those that aren't familiar, Fernando Alonso has a history of like not giving a hell about the team. Like he's going to race to have the highest finish. And we saw yesterday, we don't know, they're not going to tell one of their drivers to back off, at least not until one of them separates themselves. But Alonso was 600 more than Ocon. They both qualified very well, but we saw Ocon come in at 48% ownership compared to just 21% for Alonso. And I was actually very heavy on Alonso because I figured that's how the ownership would play out, but also because I thought there was some value to really attacking this salary range from Alpine. One, because they were both like in this awkward salary range where everybody was trying to jam in Ferrari and Red Bull and go down to the cheaper guys. And just because I thought that there was an outside chance with the relatively high likelihood of incident that like Alpine could get a double podium or even, like two top 5 finishes. So I had a few Alpine constructor teams, even had an Alonso team captain team sprinkled in. What I didn't account for is that they'd be pushing each other so hard that it would end up screwing them at the end. Unfortunately, it was my guy Alonso who I was higher on. But let's talk through some of the things that we saw in addition to Alpine battling. What stood out for you? And we'll just kind of go off of the biggest tournament DraftKings has. They had a $200,000 prize pool, 15.7K entries, a $15 buy-in. The winning lineup was Captain Verstappen, Leclerc, Albon, Latifi, Hulkenberg, and then Red Bull for constructor. That lineup was duped 43 times. The $50,000 first prize was split up to about $2,200 in change. So we saw Verstappen captain stacked with Red Bull constructor. That was one of the big things that came out from the first race, that captain constructor stack. But what stood out to you, whether it be from what you saw from lineups, what you saw from building yourself, just any kind of DFS takeaways you noticed?
Yeah, so you put out this really great chart, I believe yesterday, looking at, again, some trends for cash lineups and top 1% of lineups for both tournaments individually, and then for just sort of both tournaments combined over the last couple of weeks. And a couple of things this week, leaving salary on the table didn't really matter. Only 1% of the top 1% of lineups, which might be zero, left $1,000 or more on the table. Again, all winners sort of seem to continue to use 98% or more of their salary. we also saw that, again, stacking your captain and constructor isn't really needed to cash, but it is to win, and you need to have the winner in your captain lineup because, again, the fantasy point scoring, which is something that I wonder if, I don't know if they'll change this year, and we can get to that a little later, but Verstappen, as the captain, scored, I think, about 50 points. The next highest, and this is just among drivers, but the next highest is Leclerc at 30, and then everyone else is below 20 points. And so it's really about a stars and scrubs approach, which is, again, something that I've been trying to do, and it's just a matter of picking the right scrubs, if you will, and trying to balance ownership through them than through the top, I think, with your captain and constructor, because those guys are always going to be near the top. They're always, they have the name brand, so the sort of more casual people are going to be leaning towards them a little bit more as well. And so, like you said, the Alonso versus Ocon, the Hulkenberg versus Stroll stuff, that's where you're really going to get an edge, I think. So those are some of the big things that stood out to me.
Yeah, and again, this is why I'm glad you brought up 2 points. How people, the salary thing, I think that was just a function of DraftKings. They adjusted salaries enough to where they're still not sharp in a sense that it's getting us away from like these very obvious lineup builds, but at least it forced people like to make some decisions, whereas in that Bahrain race, we just didn't have I lost Sam, but I'll keep going. We just didn't have a hindrance for us to not leave tons of salary on the table. So just salaries being tighter kind of forced what we saw this week with more of the top lineup season, more salary. But that captain constructor stack, even though we still saw 98% of the top 1% of lineups stack their captain to constructor, we saw the cash lineups drop from 81% in the first race of lineup to cash, stack captain constructor. It dropped down to 68% in the second race. Just because this high percentage of teams and the winners have stacked captain constructor, I do still think you're making a mistake if all of your lineups are stacking captain and constructor. Ferrari as a team, as a constructor, actually scored more points than Red Bull, and Sergio Perez only scored 2.6 more fantasy points than Carlos Sainz. So even though we've seen it show up in the results, there's going to be races where just the way the fantasy points play out, it's not going to happen, because there's going to be times where the winner's teammate isn't going to do well. So even though you're going to get those winner points in both spots, you're going to have a constructor team that if it comes out that we see the podium like we did yesterday with double Ferrari, but then, if Perez crashes or has like a 10th finish, that captain constructor lineup wouldn't work out. And I do think like you're going to pretty much always need to get that winner into your captain spot. That doesn't mean always playing Verstappen and Leclerc there. Like there are going to be races where random people win. So you are going to need to have some randomish lineups. Like I said, I had some Alonso captain teams yesterday, but I do think there will come a time where the captain isn't the winner. And that's going to be like not something we could predict, but it'll be something where Leclerc leads the entire race and then Verstappen overtakes him at the end. He'll get all of those like leading lap points for the whole race, but then come in second place. A situation like that could play out. But I just think the biggest point is that we saw captain and constructor in the winners still. I don't think you should have it in 100% of your lines. But the thing I really want to dive into is the ownership. So like you talked about those lower level and mid-tier teams. There were a couple really big ownership advantages yesterday. Not all of them played out because we had some incidents, but what did you see in terms of the ownership from the big tournament yesterday?
So, quite honestly, the biggest thing, and this might have been because his price was pretty high. I think it was 7th or 8th highest. Is Kevin Magnussen only had a 14% ownership, despite knowing ahead of time that, forgetting his name now, Schumacher was not going to race. And so Magnussen was automatically going to get the +5 from that.
Yep.
And I mean, that's pretty huge for some of these drivers. He was starting 10th on the grid, so not super great, but a chance to definitely score points as well. But that was, again, one of the bigger shocks to me. I mean, you mentioned that the fact that Tsunoda still had about 10% ownership, despite not even starting. And so that's, some people just not paying attention to the pre-race stuff or things like that, which I think you'll continue to see. And not that those are going to be super, super frequent as well. But the fact that I think the last thing is Hamilton still carrying, again, about as much ownership as Magnussen as well. And that's people sticking on to the past and thinking that they're magically just going to figure things out. He's going to be able to overcome these issues. And, we talked on Saturday how you had, I think, 0 of your 20 lineups without Hamilton, or 0 with Hamilton. And so that's it. It's tough to not roster Christian McCaffrey or Tom Brady or Patrick Mahomes, whatever. But there are so many. He's got to overcome so much in that specific scenario. You did mention the massive discrepancies between Ocon and Alonso. It seems like grid position is quite literally going to be the biggest indicator of ownership. And that, I mean, it makes sense because you do have quite a bit of advantage over some teammates as well. When you're starting 4, 5, 6 positions ahead of them, or in Russell's case, 9 spots ahead of him. And, again, a little bit more shocked to not see Russell's ownership higher as well. But the grid position is just going to change things so dramatically each week.
Yeah, and I think for people that are new to DFS, that's where, besides the lineup building that I think people are really going to latch on to and just really mimic what we've seen from the top, I think in any DFS contest, we're going to get our biggest advantage from exploiting ownership. And since we haven't seen it play out yet to where the top teams or the high ownership guys haven't stumbled, we're going to see that advantage increase. People are just going to keep leaning harder into these expected sure things, and it's going to give you a higher likelihood to lap the field when the unexpected happens. So, I mean, you mentioned Lewis Hamilton, which, like, not even just him being rostered 13%, he was in 4% of captain lineups where his chance of winning the race was virtually zero. There was just the way Mercedes is running, like, for him to, I know 4% doesn't sound high, but with Red Bull and Ferrari commanding so much captain ownership, that still ranks him pretty high among other drivers that are getting captain ownership. It's just egregious. On top of that, you mentioned the 3 examples that really stood out to me for ownership were Alpine, Aston Martin, and Williams. I already talked about Ocon and Alonso. They only started 2 positions apart. Alonso was $600 more, but we saw Ocon in more than twice as many lineups. Go down to Williams. Albon was starting 2 positions ahead, only $200 more. He was in 35% of lineups versus 18% versus Latifi, so twice as many. And then Aston Martin, Lance Stroll, he did start 4 grid spots ahead, 13 versus 17th for Nico Hülkenberg, and he was 3,400. But his ownership was 38% versus 14% for Nico Hülkenberg, so more than double. So these guys are all starting within 2 to 4 grid spots of each other. They're all on very poor teams, and they're at a track that is known for very high incident rate. So sure, the likelihood of getting the +5 is higher, but I would actually argue that their upside is lower because these are teams that we don't expect to get into the points, but they can still climb the grid. You still get points for that. So someone like Latifi and Albon, I would confidently say Albon's a better driver than Latifi, but they're on a very poor team. They're both starting in the bottom 5. And if there's a couple incidents on the track and Albon's involved in it, Latifi not only can get the +5 just from finishing at a high incident rate. If he somehow finishes 13th, he's going to get the +5. He's going to climb 5 grid spots where Albon started 16th or someone like Lance Stroll starting 13th. It's going to be really hard for them to climb into the top 10 because they're competing with a lot of good drivers in that 7 to 11 or 12 driver range. It's just going to be really hard to climb. So when you can combine point upside with low ownership, I think we're going to start getting we're going to have a lot of advantage. And it almost played out that way. I mean, Hulkenberg got there, but, Latifi crashes and then Alonso's car craps out late. That could have easily happened to the other driver on the same team. And then all of a sudden, the lineups that were, if you had an Alonso, Latifi, Hulkenberg lineup, I mean, you're separating yourself from the field like crazy. So I think we should really be paying attention to those things in the weeks coming up.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's that the point you make about getting, the difference between 15th and 10th is not insurmountable.
Yeah.
The jump from 10th to 5th is
exactly
much, much more difficult because those guys, I mean, again, the Bahrain race, both Red Bulls crapping out at the end is not going to be the case every single week. I mean, they both finished strong this past week. And, it's, I lost my train of thought here, but it's a much bigger hill to climb in those spots. And, we saw Lando Norris was able to get from 11th up to 7th. He was like a 10th of a second away from 6th. So that I think is one of the few examples there, but there's just as much room for Lando Norris to drop down the rankings as there is, and probably not as much room for him to move up as well.
And that's actually that last point. There's as much room for him to move down. I think that's really important because there are negative points in Formula One DFS. So that's another thing. We talked about this before we talked about this before Bahrain. I actually think you were the one that brought it up, that we're going to have spots where bad teams qualify well. So we're like, say Alexander Albon for whatever reason, or Nicholas Latifi, for some reason they get through to Q3 and they start 9th or 10th.
Yep.
Their ownership's going to be through the roof because they're probably going to have cheap salaries and they're starting so high and they're going to have so much downside. Like those are going to be amazing ownership fades when they happen.
Yep.
Bad teams that qualify well are typically going to be really good ownership fades. I think, obviously we're only 2 weeks in, but just if you think through how these races play out, you have a lot drivers, a lot faster cars behind them, that it's going to be really hard for them. And then you're going to get negative points from high ownership guys. These are going to be great spots.
Yeah. And it's, that's what I was sort of pointing out to a little bit. I mean, Hamilton, we talked about the upside case there because they do still have a better car than, probably maybe 2/3 of the grid, but his price was just very restrictive this week. And I don't think that's going to go down. It's really in those sort of middle tiers where you're going to take advantage of that. I mean, let me see. Lando Norris here was only 12% owned. He was 6,800. So very easy to fit him potentially into a lineup with Verstappen and Leclerc, depending on how you fit the rest of your lineup. And just thinking through those types of things of what are the cars. I mean, even at the top with Verstappen only commanding, I mean, he had 36% ownership compared to 51 and 48 for Charles and Sergio, respectively. He had the third highest captain percentage. And I don't think, if he ever does like start 10th on the grid, that's going to be a case where you're going to want to fade him because it's going to be such a big gap. Granted, his car looks better than the Mercedes right now, but it's so restrictive with those higher salaries. But if you can catch a little bit of an ownership dip for starting fourth and getting less ownership at captain or driver is going to be huge.
Yeah, and that's my final ownership point was actually on Max. I knew we would be getting an ownership discount at the captain spot. I didn't think it would be so big. I think he was he might have been, I think he was 38% or something ownership, captain in Bahrain. I thought he would be down like 25 to 30 range. I thought he would split pretty evenly with Leclerc and Sergio. He was down at 19% captain, and if Max is starting in the top 4, that's just egregious because he was still his betting odds were still, I think, 265. I think he still had the second best odds to win the race, depending on the book. So to be able to be overweight on him at a captain spot, even though I didn't end up taking down the tournament, having 60% of my lineups with Max and my captain just really put me ahead of the field. So I still ended up having a profitable day almost on that alone. But it was there's a lot to take away from DFS. Again, we'll have strategy leading up. We got 2 weeks till next race. Betting markets are still pretty limited in what they offer. Dan and I talked about some interesting ones. Max was probably the one of the best bets. Anytime you could get Max at plus 250 or 260 starting in the top 4, it's almost always going to be an auto bet. They had what was it? An incident, a safety car was minus 1,000. Dan kind of joked it should have been minus 10,000, but still, that happened. We ended up with, I think, 2 virtual safety cars and a real safety car. So that was a pretty easy one. Anything stand out to you from the betting markets in terms of bets that you hit, bets you didn't hit, variance between sports books, anything like that?
So I went a very on-brand 4for4 on my bets this past week, which was nice. I think
good.
A couple of things, as I was thinking through it this morning, is to sort of target the chaos picks, if you will, earlier in the week, where the odds on, some of the worst drivers, even to finish top 10 or top 6, are going to be worse. Because, again, if they have a good grid position, then the odds are just going to shift massively.
Yeah.
But and then targeting the sort of favorites later on after qualifying, because, again, Verstappen, we saw his odds go down quite a bit because he was starting 4th, and there was still a good shot for him to win the race. And, again, I think for some of these drivers, the Red Bull and Ferrari drivers specifically, if you're in the top 4, you've got a chance to win each week. And that's a case where, if Leclerc was starting 4th in Saudi Arabia, he's probably the bet to make just from a value perspective as well.
Absolutely.
One type of bet that I want to get more into, BetMGM actually has had some non-teammate matchups. On most books, you'll get matchups just, with each of the teammates who's going to finish higher. And it's always very highly juiced towards whoever's starting at, ahead in the grid. So I was able to take, I took Hulkenberg at, I think, plus 275 to finish over Stroll, which ended up working out well. And again, that was sort of a thing where it's these guys don't really have a driver A or driver B. We're expecting some amount of chaos, and it worked out well. But again, it's similar to ownership in a sense of there was, I can't remember who it was, but it was Hamilton versus someone else. And it might have even been Lando Norris. Yeah. And those were minus 110.
Yeah, I think it might have been Bottas.
Maybe it was Bottas. Yeah. But it's still I don't know. Though the non-teammate stuff is going to be, I think, an area to exploit as well.
Yeah, I think a couple things, and I don't have legal sports betting in California, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But learning through osmosis, through guys like you and Dan and the rest of everyone at BetSperts and 4for4 betting, F1 wise, a lot of that value is going to come with early week betting. Like you said, you're like Max and Leclerc are always going to have the best odds early in the week. So betting them at plus 115 or whatever on a Monday isn't going to get you much, but betting the guys that could move up can get you a lot. And those matchups just seem really exciting. If they start to add more of those matchup bets, I think that especially with it's very similar to player props, right? If we're doing this kind of like DFS analysis, they kind of become intuitive. It's not going to take a ton of research on your part since you're already doing it. And then just these race props. Bahrain, there were a couple of weeks ago, we had the number of classified drivers over 17 and a half, and then this week the under on classified drivers. Bets like those type of random props, if you're just keeping an eye on those type of things and understanding what's going on with tracks and what racers are competing for what, I think those are really interesting.
Definitely.
Let's just talk about some general overview stuff, whether it be betting, DFS, just how we're watching the race. What are you looking for to change, whether it be in racing or what do you think should be changing as we advance into the season?
I mean, it will be interesting to see how, if at all, and how potentially DraftKings changes the DFS market, I guess, because the one thing that they changed this past week was the pricing. They raised the floor, as you and Dan talked about. And I don't know, I haven't played DFS long enough to know if, it is a new sport for them. Right now, they're the only ones who are in it. So, could a big sweeping change come? Who knows? Because it's something they probably don't know a ton about either. And thought, hey, this is a huge market. People are very interested in it because of Drive to Survive. So let's just throw it out there and see what works. I don't have any ideas off the top of my head of how they, try to reduce the dupe problem, because that is the biggest, I guess, quote unquote, issue from our perspective. But do they change the scoring so that it's either flatter or, you get some guys who, have a chance to score 20 points, even though they're, stuck at 15th in the grid, something like that. And how those changes, it'll be interesting to see again, how just the general DFS market responds. Again, we've got 2 weeks now, which isn't a ton of data, but we have 2 weeks to process and analyze it. And how does that change with the race coming up? So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of probably galaxy braining too of how to avoid things. But yeah, I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think I don't think DraftKings will do anything as dramatic as changing scoring once a season has launched. I think that would be unprecedented, and I think that would also just they already have some core users, so people that have already started, learning the game. I don't think they would do that. I think the easy fix is just pushing the salary limits up, whether it be floor, ceiling, or both. The first couple of weeks, it is just there's a group of drivers in the mid-salary range where you're just not even considering using them. So if you push up the Red Bull and the Ferrari prices, you push up the floor, maybe up to, make the floor 4K instead of 3K. It is going to force people to make some decisions. And I think that alone will help the dupe problem, because right now the player pool is the top 4 guys and then the bottom 6 or 7 guys. So if you can if you can make every player in the pool viable, there's only 20 racers, there's only 10 constructors. So if you can make at least every racer, maybe not every constructor is going to be viable, but if you can make every single racer viable, the combination of lineups is going to go through the roof. And it's still such a new product for DraftKings. It's obviously not a revenue leader for them. The biggest prize pool this upcoming race is only $150,000. But at the same time, because it is so new, I do think that they're probably not putting a lot of time into it, and it is a spot where I do think they will listen to their core user base. So don't go on Twitter and tell them they're stupid, but if you see someone like me or Sam or some, Justin Freeman is a guy for Run the Sims that's really been diving into it. If you see us tweeting about it, tag DraftKings, just mention that we all think that can help, and I think they would listen because they're probably not putting a lot of time into it themselves.
Yeah.
Like we talked about earlier in the show, I do think we'll see different lineup strategies at the top of some of these tournaments. We haven't had, obviously, Max and Sergio don't finish in Bahrain, but Ferrari cars both finish 1-2. There's going to be a week where Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen are they're going to rub elbows, and if they both end up out of a race, the whole slate is flipped. Like, those things are going to happen. So anticipate those things happening. If you're playing single entry lineups, sure, it's going to be hard to fade them. But if you're playing 20 to 100 lineups, you should be building for that. So just anticipate some of those. I do think one thing that we're going to start getting a grasp on really quickly is ownership projections. I think we're going to be able to start really leveraging those, and that will start helping us thinking through ways to just avoid or minimize duplicates, even if we don't see sweeping changes in salary. And then just paying attention to, like, we still don't know a lot about these cars or these teams yet. We're only 2 races in. All of these teams are still trying to figure out their cars. We saw, half the teams had a car crap out on Sunday. Mercedes is still going to get their stuff together. They still have many resources as any team. That, like, money drives this sport. Mercedes is going to do everything they can to get it right. Are they going to push for a championship? Probably not, but they're going to make DFS and betting hard at some point, I believe. And then we still haven't even had any weather at a track. So I think what we've seen, especially in DFS markets, just because it's worked 2 weeks in a row, I would not take it as gospel.
And to your point,
yeah,
Mercedes might not compete for a championship, but they're sure as hell going to want to spoil it for someone else.
Oh, absolutely.
Whether it's Red Bull, Ferrari, whoever, and try to keep that name brand alive as well for as many races as they can.
Yeah, definitely. Anything that you see in the first 2 weeks that you're loving or that you expect to stick around? Again, general racing, DFS, or betting wise.
That's a really good question. I mean, so much. I think it's the broadcast is certainly interesting to watch. And, you mentioned one thing I wanted to say at the top of the show, you talked about the sort of data versus the film.
Mm-hmm.
I think the good side, like, I am very much on the data side as well. But the nice thing about this is these races only last 2 hours, and you can basically get everything out of the race. Sure, you're not watching every single driver the entire time, but you understand, again, Leclerc was leading basically from the start, and Max and him had their battle at the end. You saw the Alpine jousting throughout the middle of the race when really nothing was going on at the front of the race or at the front of the grid. And you get a sense of, like, which of these cars are faster than one another, which of the drivers are actually better than one another. Because, again, like, Alonso doesn't finish the race, and if Ocon is starting ahead of Alonso next, I want to say next week, but in the next race, I'm for sure going with Alonso because he looked like the stronger driver. I
agree.
He was able to overtake Ocon, and it was just like tough luck that his car crapped out. And so not taking too much stock into some of those types of things. Again, like with the Red Bull thing, stuff like that. I do think there is quite a bit of, not a ton, but specifically this might be more along the lines of betting where markets are changing more dynamically, is paying attention to the news and understanding what the teams are saying and what some of the reports are coming out. Because, again, we heard last week that Red Bull had fixed their issue, and they did. And they were totally fine. And I think once Mercedes says, like, yep, we're good, we're ready to go, like, we've got this down, and then we see a result, then there's going to be a lot of trying to figure out, okay, of these top six drivers, who do you pick and who's going to win the race?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the throughout the week, as you said, pertaining to the betting markets, those markets are fluid almost down to the minute. So getting
Yeah.
value, it still takes a fair amount of work, and DFS as well. But the thing that I'm really loving about Formula One DFS is that you really can't do any prep till qualifying's over. Like you could get an
Yeah.
idea of how like lineups might work and how salaries might fit together, sure, but everybody is like on that same even playing field that until qualifying's over, we got about 18 hours to qualifying to be done to the race starting to figure out what everybody's doing, how things are going to shake out ownership wise and how those salaries fit together. So that's what I actually am really excited just about that aspect of Formula One. And like you said, if you are new, if you're only watching the network coverage, you're still going to get a ton of information. The great thing about it being a niche sport is that any major publication or anybody that has a significant following at this point in F1, they're giving like the big names, especially the European guys, they're giving you some very high quality content. It's really well thought out. It's really smart compared to a sport like NFL where there's obviously a ton of great content, but there's also a ton of horrible content that just people have no idea what they're talking about, and you just kind of have to wade through and figure it out. I obviously with Formula One gaining popularity in the States and betting and DFS gaining popularity, we might get it watered down a little bit, but right now anybody that's established in the F1 market in the media, they are very insightful, and you could get a lot of really great information right now.
Yep. Without a doubt.
Yeah, so we have a 2-week break between races now, so we get to kind of digest what's been happening, sit back for a couple weeks, but we will be back in 2 weeks with the preview show for the Australian Grand Prix. It'll be 2 of myself, Dan, Sam, or Jen on here. Again, a crazy time for that race, so be prepared if you're on the East Coast to have your Red Bull and vodka late night so you could stay up and watch it. If you haven't signed up for 4for4 yet, if you sign up for a 4for4 betting plan right now, all betting subs get a free subscription to BetSperts Golf. Masters Week is coming up. BetSperts Golf is doing a ton over there. You will get access to the 4for4 Discord, where you can get, Ryan and Connor are up to the second on bets to be placed, whether it be golf, NFL futures, or any other sports you're into. And I've been in there the last couple of days on the F1 Discord, which we just launched. So if you sign up for the betting or the DFS plan, you will get access to that F1 Discord. If you haven't played F1 on DraftKings yet, check out the link in the YouTube description. That will hook you up with access to DraftKings. And if you are into football, which if you're a 4for4 follower, you probably are, Underdog has a great promo. You can get a free 4for4 pro sub if you just deposit $10 on Underdog using the promo code 4for4. You will also get a bonus deposit match up to $100. You must be a new Underdog user. See the link in the description for that deal. As always, please like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening, please rate and review, whether it be on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever else you listen to your podcast. And make sure you're following all of us. 4for4 is at 4for4 Football. Check out BetSperts at BetSperts Golf. Sam is at Sam Hoppen. I'm at TJ Hernandez. Talk to you guys in a couple weeks.